continue our lessons in church history. And this morning we're going to be looking at the monastic reaction. We talked about previously the rise of Constantine, the beginning of the imperial church age, and we talked about then Eusebius of Caesarea, the historian, of how he viewed things, how he viewed it in a favorable way. Well, there's some people who weren't so crazy about it. They viewed the influx of people, the change in the way things were done, the pomp, the circumstances, the lax behavior, etc., not so nice, and they react to it. And this is from chapter 15 in Gonzalez's book, so if you want to read more on it, we're only going to be able to cover a little bit of the detail because this is actually a very complicated movement. It's a very complicated idea, but it is going to have tremendous impact early on and later on through even unto today. We're going to see even the Reformation is affected because who was Martin Luther? Huh? He was a monk, guys like that. You see this whole monastic idea going to be changing and growing and morphing and getting good and getting bad and influencing the church positively and negatively. We're going to see all sorts of stuff that's going to come out of it. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to begin sort of looking at the roots of the monastic movement and where it began and why, and then how it accelerated. And it actually begins before this imperial age, but it really takes off during this. We're then going to look at sort of the two types of monks, the solitary monks of the desert or the anchorite monks, and then we're going to see the communal monks, which are referred to as Cenobite monks, and we're going to see how that whole idea develops. And then we're going to see how this movement that begins basically sort of in Egypt really spreads across the, if you will, Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, what do you want to call it, Christendom, the known world, quote unquote, at the time. And it's going to then continue on and continue on and continue on. And it's actually going to save some things just in the future. We'll mention that a little bit. But it's quite amazing what ends up happening out of this monastic movement. So here's where we are. We're in a time period, this is before Constantine, so this we're going to talk about the roots of it. It's before Constantine, and during these times you see the opportunity for people when there's a persecution to become a quote-unquote a professor, a confessor, and because they're a martyr or they stood firm. And they can demonstrate their faith through the care and the standing firm, the I am for the truth, and I'm going to live my life for the truth, and I don't care what comes. And sort of, in some places, it's just a respect for those people. In other places, it kind of becomes a badge of honor. And that's kind of waning. We saw that a couple of weeks ago. We saw the persecution under Diocletian. That was a really big deal. But by the time we get to Constantine, we don't have to worry about that. So there's this interlude, there's the Diocletian persecution, and then, sort of peace, if you will, after Constantine. So to many people, when they see this transition, they're going to see it in a negative light. And the beginnings of monastic thinking isn't really so much Christian, though it can be couched in Christian terms, and from one perspective, it's kind of a godly type of thing. But we know that being solitary, the scriptures speak against going off on your own. You need to be part of a group. The church builds the church. The body builds the body. Being on your own doesn't necessarily build you. Certainly you can learn, certainly you can grow, but that's not the way that the scriptures teach for a body of believers to function. Now, a lot of these people early on, and again, before Constantine and as it moves forward on, they kind of pull in some of the Gnostic ideas, they pull in Platonic ideas, other Greek philosophical ideas, and they start beginning to see that this isolation, this being prayerful and holy and separate and all these things, they start bringing in, here's the Christian element of it. Remember when we talked about the Gnostics and how they began to, and Marcion and all, they started pulling in the two approaches. It was either control your body or, who cares about your body? Well, these are the folks who fall into the Christian form of control your body. Now, that was not an unusual thing. And scripturally, they'll say, hey, look, there's widows and virgins dedicating themselves to the service of God. Some people really literally went to the point of saying, hey, I'm going to castrate myself for the kingdom. You're like, that doesn't feel good. But, they might be a little crazy, but a lot of them were just really serious about it. And then there was others who said, I want to choose not to marry, so I'm reflecting the eternal state because you'll be neither married nor given in marriage, but be like the angels. And I want to start reflecting that now in my life so I can freely serve. And, look at the Apostle Paul. I mean, this guy was, alone. He didn't have any encumbrances. So I want to dedicate myself, and that's okay. That is how God has gifted you. Eventually, we're going to see how the celibacy of the priesthood, if you will, comes about. There's a lot that goes on with that one, so I'm not going to go into the details of how that all comes about and why. But we still see some of these ideas of celibacy is not such a bad thing. Now, again, the Platonic ideas, and again, these are things that when we talked about Origen, he sort of followed this type of thinking that living should be done at a simplistic or a minimalistic level. And practicing of extreme asceticism, in other words, controlling the body and the passions, and this was supposed to make you wise from a Platonic perspective. The Stoics had the idea of the physical body was a prison for the soul, again, that sort of Gnostic idea that you had to sort of practice on perfecting and subjugating the passions of the body so that your spirit or your soul could be free. And we see cultic practices of the sacred versions. Yes, the sacred virgins. This is a version too. It's sacred. No, the sacred virgins. We see that cult. We see that kind of a thing that was practiced in Rome with this type of idea. We see the idea of celibacy in priests. We see the idea and the notion of eunuchs in all these other kinds of things. So what they could do, they could set themselves apart to serve the gods. Now, all that's to say is being a monk, going all the way on your own, being celibate, castrating yourself, being a eunuch, etc., living in a community with other people that are focusing yourselves on your faith wasn't strange. Matter of fact, it was kind of normal. So the idea that we kind of think, monasticism came out of nowhere, it didn't. It just sort of grew out of natural tendencies in the culture and applied to Christianity. And some of it good, some of it bad. And again, we're going to see how that all plays out. So those are kind of the roots of it. That's kind of the ideas behind it, the cultural context, and then how people then use the scriptures to sort of justify this is what I want to do. Now, we're now going to turn to the solitary monks. And these are the monks of the desert. And this really takes hold before Constantine, but again, like I said, accelerates dramatically afterwards. And so we're going to talk about some of these early monks. Now, there's lots of them, but we only have a few of them we have much information on, so naturally you talk about the ones that you know about. So these people, both men and women, it wasn't just men, wanted to find some area of solitude in the desert. And it wasn't so much for harshness, but just to have a quiet place to reflect. And as parents, we all kind of know that, hey, can I have my quiet time? I need a place that I can focus and keep my thoughts, and I want to focus myself on God. Well, in their understanding, going away from people, going away from the busyness, that's what they wanted to do, to be solitary so they could focus their time for God. And the term for monk, where we get the word monk as it morphs, is monakos, and this means solitary. And that term was generally applied to those who sort of left the world behind. They sort of, I'm out on my own, a monk or monakos. The other term that I mentioned before was the idea of an anchorite. An anchorite were these monks, monakos, that went away to a solitary life. And that originally meant to withdraw or to be a fugitive. In other words, you're away from everybody. Now, a lot of times these guys would seek secluded valleys, oases, so they weren't just going out and going, hey, let's go find the toughest place I can. No, they actually went to places like that, or they'd go to abandoned cemeteries or places that they felt that the world is not going to intrude upon me. Two of the most famous, and again, it's because we have some writings and it's a description of them, were Paul and Anthony. These are the two that we're going to talk about, and Jerome, who we're going to talk about a little bit later, sort of immortalizes one, and Athanasius, who again we're going to talk about later, writes about the other. And actually, Athanasius brings a lot of monastic things to the West, we're going to see. Now, little is known about Paul. As I just said, well, yes, Jerome wrote about him, but there's little known about him. There's not a lot. So there's things that we kind of glean from him. The best thing we can tell is this guy probably lived in the middle of the 200s or middle of the 3rd century. And he fled persecution to live a life in the desert. And he wanted to spend his time in prayer and supposedly lived on a diet of dates. Okay, so I guess you can, and that's dates not going out, dates the fruit from the date palm. Now, that's about as much as we know. There's not a lot more about him, but he's kind of famous for being out there. The guy that we have a little bit more detail on, and actually I'm going to talk more about, is a gentleman named Anthony. And from what we know about him, is he was born in a very small village along the Nile River. And again, his parents weren't particularly Christian per se, but they were wealthy, and they died when he was young. He hears the gospel in a church. Again, so if you notice here, he hears the gospel in a church. And the thing about the rich young ruler, so he hears about the rich young ruler, and this causes him to say, I need to leave my wealth behind. I need to give up everything and, follow Jesus, so to speak. And a little bit overly literal about what the point was, but he literally takes it. And he gives this all up, but he places his sister, who he's still responsible for, in the care of the virgins of the church. So in other words, we had some of these women that were virgins setting themselves apart and says, here, care for my sister. And so he leaves and he says, okay, I'm going to go to the desert. I'm going to find a monk and learn from him. So he finds an older monk. So good discipleship, passing on, iron sharpening iron. So good stuff. Maybe misapplied, but he's going out there to learn about God from this elder monk. And he goes, after he's learned from this guy, he goes deeper and deeper into the desert. So if a little bit's good, more is better. Have to be careful about that. And around the age of 35, okay, so he's a young adult now, and in his culture, he's actually transitioning from young man to an adult in that culture. He has a vision, and he says God told him not to fear. God would protect him, so he moves even further out into the desert. He is pursued by people who say, hey, this guy's really godly. I want to learn from him. Anybody been pursued saying, hey, this person's so godly, I want to learn from them? Probably, hopefully, our godliness should precede us, and people should want to do that. But in this case, this guy is pursued by folks. Now, for a solitary monk, what do you think the worst possible thing could happen to you is? Yeah, people pursuing you. Everybody wanted a piece of you. You're like, wait a second, I came to the desert. I wanted to get alone. I wanted to serve God. And you guys keep following me. Well, he also is pursued by demons and who desire to harm him. Eventually he stops and he agrees to teach some other monks his way, as long as they will most of the time leave him alone. All right, so he says, look, I'll teach you guys and then go away. Don't bother me. I need to practice my solitude. He locks himself away, literally. And he doesn't go very far. He goes away, and people pursue him and all, but he does sometimes leave and go back to civilization. And he does actually visit Alexandria. I mean, this is a huge city. He's this guy from a little mud huts on the Nile out in the desert, but he actually goes to Alexandria, and he does this twice. And one of the times was he goes during the Diocletian persecutions we talked about a couple of weeks back. That it was Diocletian's harshness, and he's going, oh good, I can stand here, I can profess my faith, and they'll kill me and I'll be a martyr. And the leader in Alexandria says, this dude is too raggedy looking This guy has no standing. I'm not going to waste my time killing him. Kind of weird, but he's like, you're not even worthy of killing. You're too, go away, crazy man. Not interested in killing you. You make no point. The second time he goes, though, and this is kind of a very interesting thing. We're going to talk about this later, is he goes during what's referred to as during the time of the Arian heresy, or the debate over Arianism and Arius. And again, we'll talk more about that. And he goes out there and he says, now, wait a second. You guys are claiming that I support Arius. Anthony supports Arius. And he heard about this. And he goes, I do not believe that. I do not support that. That is absolutely wrong. Now, according to Athanasius, and again, we're going to talk about Athanasius in another lesson, he records that though Anthony was illiterate and spoke in Coptic, that was a Egyptian Greek type of language, he confounded the Arians with his wisdom and conviction. In other words, you're like, this crazy guy who can't read understands the scripture better than all these people in the city of Alexandria, the education capital of the world. Sound familiar? That, truth wins. They didn't like it, but he was very powerful, and I think that's probably why Anthony made such an impression on Athanasius. Later on, Anthony permits 2 younger monks to take care of him, and in his old age, he dies in the year 365. So this guy lived a very long time in the desert as a monk. So this guy has a significant impact on people because he lives a long time. Just like the Donatists, it was named after Donatus because Donatists led their party for 50 years. Well, here Anthony has an impact on it. Now, what would monkish life look like? Now, we're going to talk about the sort of the ebb and flow of what the monks are going to look like from kind of their lifestyle and some of the things that happen with them. But first off, it was very simple. Most people's lives were relatively simple anyway, but monks were even simpler simple. They sometimes would plant gardens for food, but more often they would basically make baskets or other kinds of things and trade them for bread and oil. And a lot of you might go, hey, wait a second, you can't live on bread and oil. Well, that kind of bread you actually can, but we won't go into the chemistry of it. But bread and oil, that would give him the carbohydrates, some protein, and some fat in that. And he could actually live on it. And they spent most of their time praying, reciting psalms, and memorizing scripture. They considered owning books. Now think about your library. Think about what you have in your own house. They considered owning books as possible temptation that could lead to pride. Now, for us, it's like, there's books everywhere. Matter of fact, I got so many books I can't even read all my books. Well, that's because books are now common. Well, if you had books back then, that was wealth. That cost a lot. That was precious stuff. So, in other words, it's like, I have the fanciest home on the golf course with the biggest car and my own private jet and all my other stuff, and boy, aren't I something. That's kind of the equivalent for owning a book to a monk. Though, honestly, I would love to own a book so that you could, refer it, make sure you didn't make any mistakes. But they said books could lead to pride. And so they only had clothing that they absolutely needed and a mat to sleep on. That's pretty much it. That's a pretty simple life. Now, think about this. You've got the monks over here that are living this simple life. And then you have all of the quote-unquote church leaders over here. And what have they done? They've gone from that simple Christianity to robes and processions and money and power and hobnobbing with the government and the leaders and the powerful people. See the contrast? Monk, I got a mat and bread and oil and a little bit, and I pray, and that's it. And these guys are involved in everything, and they have lots because it's just totally transforming the normal quote-unquote church because of this influence of the imperial, if you will, oversight and support and encouragement. Now, these monks really didn't spend a lot of time with other believers, and that's a problem. And you get into issues when you start going off on your own, and this is one of the dangers for any of us. When we are separated from the body and learning and growing, even if there's problems, you're going to have the other risk of having issues. They didn't really involve with communal worship. They weren't involved with any other practices, communions, or any other kinds of things that typify the early church, which is what they were trying to, simplify. Well, they oversimplified. They didn't say, "Hey, here's a small group of us. We're worshiping together and all." They just went away. And this is those anchorites. Now, when they fled temptation, that didn't always go away, because as the saying goes, everywhere you go, there you are. Let that sink in. Everywhere you go, there you are. And so temptation doesn't go away just because you're isolated. It's still there. You still got your brain. It's still functioning. Everything you see around you is going to tempt you. Satan's going to try to. Temptation's not bad. Giving into temptation is your problem, or our problem, or my problem, all of our problems. And sometimes, though, if you're over, hey, I'm praying, I'm reading, I'm memorizing Scripture, I'm setting myself apart for God, boy, am I holier than thou. Especially when you start seeing these other guys that aren't particularly holy, not particularly godly. You kind of get this, we're better than you kind of a thing. And unfortunately, the monks tended, because of their isolation, and tended to have not particularly educated in many instances, not all. They were easily influenced and manipulated and fired up by those who wanted to use them. And later on in the 5th century, now that we're in the 3rd century, when we get to the 5th century, and we find monks rioting, and so that they can impose their orthodox teaching on people. So if I can't convince you, I'm going to fight you to convince you. And so you can see there's going to be some problems with this. Again, intent good, missing some pieces, some of the results good, some of the results bad. And so there's some sort of mixed challenges. Now, what do you think if we get lots of people who want to go out to be alone? What do you think is going to happen? Yeah, it's going to be tough places to find places you could be alone, right? What else? You might have to double up, huh? Or triple up, or maybe form a commune, because there's not enough places. I think one of the writers said that along the Nile there were so many monks living all by themselves, it was kind of crowded. It's like, there's a monk there, there's a monk there, there's a monk there, there's a monk there, there's a monk there. They're all solitary together, just a few little bit apart from each other. It was tough. And so what we're going to find is there's going to be this development of the communal life. And that's what we're going to now look at. We're going to look at the communal monks. And so these people who wanted to go out for solitary reasons end up becoming what's referred to as Cenobite monks, or Cenobitic monasticism. And that's from the Greek words which mean communal life. In other words, living together. Now, there's lots of instances of it, and there's different pieces and different people. But again, we're just going to focus in on one guy that we have some good information on, had a very significant impact. And his name was Pachomius. And Pachomius was born around 286 in a small village in southern Egypt. See if you notice the same pattern down in southern Egypt. He was not raised in a Christian home, though. So he did not have a Christian home. But he was taken from his home to serve in the military. And during this time, some Christians took pity on him, cared about him, helped him out, and befriended him. And he was very touched by this act of kindness, and he said, if I ever get out of the military, I'm going to dedicate myself to serving others. And lo and behold, let's see, he gets let out because some unexpected event happens. And he goes about and he wants to find somebody who can teach him about Christianity. And he does that. He tries to learn his faith. And he later moves into the desert and wants to become an anchorite monk. And remember, anchorite monks were the solitary ones. Cenobitic or Cenobite monks were the communal ones. And so he starts off as that anchorite monk, that solitary monk. And he goes out there to do this. And he learns from this other anchorite and eventually moves away from him, and then is joined by his brother. So Pachyminus' brother comes. And he's not really content just with the service, and he prays to God and he says, all right, how do I serve you more? This is a good thing. It's a good prayer to ask and say, how do I serve you more? And according to, what's written about this guy is he said he had a vision that he was to serve mankind. And Pachyminus, kind of like Peter, he says, no, wait a second. I'm supposed to serve God. I'm not supposed to serve man. And like Peter was like, rise, kill, and eat. Oh, no, Lord, I don't do that. I never do that. And if you really think about it, the scripture says, what are you supposed to do? Love God and others. Serve God and others. Well, these guys were like, I'm just serving God, and he forgot about the serving others. As a matter of fact, these guys were kind of offended. You mean you want me to actually work with people? I'm supposed to be off my own serving you and loving you, God. And according to records, he realized that this continued repeated, and eventually he goes, all right, I will serve God and men. I will do that. And you begin the formation of monasteries. He sets about trying to organize and teach men about prayer and about contemplation. Now, this is kind of interesting. When he tries this, his first attempt fails miserably. Now, why do you think his first attempt fails miserably? This is going to be interesting. What do you think? He wasn't a good organizer. Well, yeah. We're going to see later he is actually a very good organizer. What do you think? What would be the things that would cause you to fail? That's never been done before. Well, yeah, there's some models, but yeah, in general, it's never been tried in this particular area. He doesn't have any experience with it. Anything else? Well, you know what? The thing that that causes him to fail is his standards aren't high enough. He's not rigorous enough. He doesn't pick the right people. Does this sound familiar? If you make the standards so low and you pick the people so low, nobody's ever going to follow through with it. There's no consequence to it. He fails miserably because there is no rigor demanded. He's just like, hey, let's get together. So he tries again. And this time, instead of, dropping the standards more, well, maybe if we just make it easier on them or give them more bread or do something else, it'll be better, which is our tendency, quite honestly, in our society. Just make it easier and then we'll come. No. He steps it up. He demands a higher level. He says, no, if we're going to serve God and we're going to serve men, it's going to be done right. We're going to do it with zeal and gusto and all the other things, and we're going to be disciplined about it, and we're all going to do this. So he sets this very, very high bar for anybody to get into this monastic idea. And the renouncement of earthly goods, everybody works with their hands, no matter what it is, the most menial task, and absolute obedience to the authorities were hallmarks. Okay? Renounce the worldly goods, work hard, and obey. That's pretty tough stuff. But people come flocking to this. I mean, isn't it better to live with godly people who work hard and you have somebody who you can trust and respect in charge than to be out there with, if you will, the flakes? People really look at this and say, man, this is a high standard. This is something that I want to dedicate myself to, because, see, he's not just saying, let's go away and not be involved with people. He's saying, I'm going to serve God. We're going to dedicate ourselves to serving God, but we're also going to serve people, because that's what God has commanded us to do. That is an amazing thing. So again, this whole monastic idea is going to, especially the communal idea, is going to have tremendous impacts, both positively and negatively, because guess what happens to monasteries? People are in them, and they go bad. But they get renewed, and then they go bad, and they get renewed, and we're going to see that. And so this guy, during his life, created 9 communities, several of them with several hundred monks in them each. And these were under a leadership or a superior, and they established the groups of people with different areas of work and assigned those to the community. And nobody was immune. Leader, clean out the toilet, you did it. Take out the trash, you did it. Feed the pigs, you did it. It didn't matter. Everybody served. And sometimes they were organized around trades or skills because people had them. And they really organized it. It became a very efficient type of organization. They lived together. They had men and women, and they typically separated them. And what they would do is they start off, they lived, they worked, they would sing, recite scripture, and meditate upon biblical passages. They would get together twice a day to sing, pray, and listen to scriptures, once in the morning, once in the evening. And Pachomius' sister, Mary, founded a similar set of communities for women under the authority of an ultimate superior or abbot, or the Archimandrites. I'm very good at pronouncing words. Archimandrites, so the abbot, they were in charge of everything. And so when Pachomius dies, or as he's dying, he says, okay, folks, here's how it's going to work. All of you monks, whoever I pick from amongst of you, every one of you is going to vow obedience to them. So he didn't have this Roman Empire chaos of who's going to vote and intrigue and whatever. He says, whoever I pick as the guy, as the abbot, and I pick the next one, that person has absolute authority. You all agree, every one of you agrees to obey that person. And I don't care if that person denounces the superiors in these other communities or deals with issues, that guy's in charge. And that's the way he established it. So he has this continuity idea through authority and obedience to the ultimate ruler. And the thing that's interesting is you would think with this type of behavior, you would think that these monks would be more like a church hierarchy. And in some ways they kind of were, but very, very, very few of them were church leaders. Elders, deacons, bishops, whatever. They weren't church leaders. They just served in their community. So it was like, here's our lifestyle that we have, but we're not those who are in charge of the church. The monks actually went to church. And that's a huge difference. They would actually go and participate with the community. They would be involved in the church, baptisms, communion, service. That's what they would do. Now later on, and I think it's in England, if my memory serves me, but there were a few English monks who were also quote-unquote priests, and they were referred to as friars. So Friar Tuck, he supposedly was a priest and a monk simultaneously. So there were occasions later on that you see that, but very few of them did. We'll see Martin of Tours got sucked into that here in a second. But these guys were very dedicated. Now, how did you get in? You know, fill out a reform, an application. How do you think they got in? What do you think it was? They were recommended. They paid their way. It's kind of simple. You had to be persevering. What they would do is they literally would have a gate across their community. And you would come up and you would walk up to the gate and say, let me in. I want to let in. Please let me in. And they look at you and go, we'll see. And they made you just wait outside the gate for as long as the gatekeeper decided whether you were worthy of coming in. And then they said, okay, now we're going to teach you. You're going to be a quote unquote a novice type of idea. You're going to come in and we're going to teach you what this is about. And until you finally say, yea, verily, I really want it, we're not letting you into full participation. But we're going to teach you, we're going to show you, and if you want to be it, then you're going to kind of sort of take your vows, and you're going to obey the authority, and you're going to follow our practice, and you're going to do this stuff. Otherwise, you're gone. We're not going to let you in. So they had to be very disciplined and desirous to get in, and then once you were in, you were trained and taught before you were let in. They had to be catechized and baptized before they were allowed to be full members. And it's interesting. You would think, hey, it's all the Christians that are coming to the monasteries. There were a lot of pagans, because again, we've talked about that background. They were like, wow, these guys are industrious. These ladies work hard. This is a good organized community. They work, they provide. You know, it's a simple life, but it's a good life. And pagans were coming in flocks to the monasteries saying, hey, let us in, let us in, let us in. It's kind of weird. That was the life. And we're going to see Later on, when we get to Julian the Apostate, he was, as a Roman emperor, he actually says, the thing that I cannot stand is these Christians are so generous and caring. You pagan priests, you need to become like them. Well, the pagans were seeing the Christians in the monasteries so godly, they wanted to be part of it. And this whole monastic thing is later on going to become a powerful evangelistic tool. The life of these people, when they showed up and when they got there, really made an impact on folks. Of course, people like the Vikings like to kill them, but that's a whole different story. So now how does the last thing we're going to look at is sort of how does this idea spread, this idea of monasticism. We're going to talk about that here. So first off, this movement begins as something that is a fleeing from the church and its potential evils. And yet it's going to, because of its devout character, it's going to influence the church. It's going to come back on it. We're going to talk about a guy named Martin of Tours, and we're going to see how his life affects it. We've mentioned Martin before, but we're going to come back to him. This discipline and dedication, what do you think it becomes? What do you think? Yeah, the people like it. True. But think about it. Think about the idea of a confessor or a martyr, and you can't do that anymore. What do you think this might become symbolic of? Yeah, it's this holiness. It's that same type of an idea. And these confessors are no longer available, but I now can have the monastic practices that can be emulated. I can be like this guy. I can be like these people. I can live a life like them. So the practice of my life is now reflected in the monastic idea, and therefore that makes me kind of look godly. Now, didn't Paul warn about the practice of godliness, the buffeting of the body and all this that has a form that appears to be religious? Well, some of these people are doing this for the right reasons, and other people are doing it for a form of religion. And we're going to see that negative impact that's going to happen later on. Now, the church does see that this is going to be advantageous in the future. We're going to see the gospel is going to be used. It's going to be used later on, the saving the scriptures, evangelical movements, missionary movements are all going to end up being founded and run from these monasteries as time progresses. Not this now, but later on. But the thing that I wanted to finish up on is talking about one guy. His name is Martin of Tours, and we've mentioned him before. And we're going to talk about him. His life was celebrated in the book The Life of Saint Martin by Sulpicius Severus. All the names I can't pronounce. And he's the example of this monk and how people started seeing monks, and they ultimately began to see that this monastic life ought to now be reflected in their bishops, as opposed to this pomp and circumstance stuff. And yet, a lot of the established church goes, these guys are a bunch of mongrels. This is the office of Christ. This is the office that should be presented to the public in a God-honoring way. It should be noted. So you're going to get this problem. There's a truth in both of those kinds of statements, but you fall off the edge either direction, you're going to have an issue. But the monastic movement is going to kind of pull that pomp and circumstance back down, because the people are going to say, well, who's the godly one? The one that's dressed fancy and talks big words, or the guy who's living a simple life and acting godly? Of course, we also are going to see that there are going to be godly people in the church and scoundrels in the monasteries, but that's a whole other thing we're going to talk about. So, Martin of Tours. He was born in 335, so it's a little bit after Constantine, in Pannonia, which is now part of Hungary. And his father was a pagan soldier, and he moved a lot in the empire with the legions, of course, in particularly in northern Italy. And when Martin was young, he decided, hey, I want to become a Christian. His parents weren't real crazy about that idea. So they said, what can we do with the guy who wants to be a Christian? I know, stick him in the army. So gets him away from his Christian friends, sticks him in the army. He fights and serves under a guy we're going to talk about later, Julian the Apostate, which is kind of interesting because Julian is the guy who wants to get rid of Christianity and bring back the Roman gods. And the thing that sort of sets him apart, this is where the stories all circle around, is when he was near the city of Amiens, which is in, I think it's in northern France, if my memory serves me. He sees this beggar, and he wants some alms. He says, give me something. And Martin goes, I don't have anything. Oh, but I do have something. So he takes off his cloak, and he cuts it in half, and he takes part of it, and he gives the other half to this beggar. And supposedly a vision, he's visited by Jesus in a dream. And Jesus says, inasmuch as you did to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. So, quoting the scriptures. And so this is the picture. If you want to know what's Martin of Tours associated with, this. And later on, supposedly there was the church claimed to have a piece of the original cape, or the capella, from Martin, from this event. And there became a practice of putting a piece of cloth at the front of these small churches, sort of the reminder of what did Martin do. He gave part of his and gave it to this person, in other words, caring for other folks. And that capella, which was put in the churches in the front, those little churches started being referred to as chapels, or from the capella. A chapel is eventually what the word morphs into. And the people who served others and cared for others, and particularly associated with the society and the military, became known as chaplains. So his cape, the capella, becomes a symbol which is used in small churches, which become chapels, and those who served in those churches to help others become chaplains. And this is how that whole idea of caring and serving and giving and helping out others. Now, later in Martin's life, after he leaves the military, he visits a godly bishop in Poitiers, Hilary of Poitiers, and this is again in France. And this is right near the Poitiers here, and then there was a battle that we're going to see later on in Poitiers, and the Battle of Tours, which we'll also see, where you get Charles Martel, the hammer, sending back the Islamic invasions. But that's later. This Hilary of Poitiers, he was a very godly man. He was very educated, and Martin learned a tremendous amount from him. And he devotes himself to that monastic lifestyle. And he sort of becomes famous in the region for his very gracious and godly life, and a very godly man. And supposedly God performs these great works through him, but he remains humble. So now if you notice here, you got this guy who's serving others, who's caring others, who's learning for others, who's living a simple life, and is humble. You see this whole beautiful picture of Christ-likeness, if you will. It wasn't necessarily that money or wealth was bad, but he kept himself, pure from becoming corrupted by all of the stuff that was around him. Now, when the Bishop of Tours dies and the bishopric becomes available, the people in the area wanted Martin to take over. And Martin's going, whoa, not what I'm interested in. And a lot of the bishops kind of overseeing this whole process, this guy's kind of a dirty, unkempt, ratty guy with a little bit of clothes. He's not really well off. We really want a bishop like that? Is that the kind of guy we want representing the church? And when they felt he would sort of dishonor it because he's too scruffy. And when it comes to the time where they were going to vote on who the person is, the person who's supposed to do the reading during this service doesn't show up. It can't be found. And so somebody else says, okay, you open up the Bible and just read something. And so here's the text they read from Psalm 8:2. It says, by the mouth of babes and infants thou hast founded a bulwark because of thy foes, and still the enemy and the avenger. And so the crowd goes, oh, God's speaking to us. Look, that means Martin should be the bishop. I'm not sure how that translates, I guess. Out of the mouth of babes and infants, you've founded a bulwark because of my foes. Okay. But they take that as a sign. We need to elect Martin. And so they elect Martin. And Martin doesn't like the pomp of the office. He therefore says, okay, we got this big cathedral here, this big church, and I'm going to build on this little room that I'm going to practice my monastic lifestyle in. So there's my little room. Here's your big church. I'm just going to stay over there and do my job. But even there, he's like, people will not leave me alone. I cannot practice my lifestyle. It's too busy. I just need some peace. So eventually he moves to the outskirts of Tours and performs his duties from there. So he's now a monastic monk guy who is a bishop. And what ends up happening is because of his godliness, because of his humility, because of the way he lives his life and honors God in it, people start going, you know what? Our bishops ought to look like Martin a lot more than the imperial-looking bishops they are. Now, we're going to talk about it later, but during the Arian heresy, Martin actually gets run out of town by the Arians. It's kind of very interesting. He gets persecuted by them. So he's going to be coming and going. But ultimately, he is a guy who is seen as a model of what a bishop should be, a true God-honoring man, which that's what the Bible says you should be as an elder, if you will. So monastic life, simple life, but honored God and was humble in all of it. So a lot of material there, a lot of stuff that's going on. But this whole monastic idea that started with these anchorite solitary people going away to, pray and learn and grow but be alone, moves and morphs into this communal idea of serving God and others that's separate from the church, but it's not a church. See, they could have formed themselves their own church. But what happens is this influence now that they left to flee the church now actually starts coming back into the church. And it becomes actually one of the most powerful things of spreading the gospel. And later on we're going to see that as a monastery forms, a town forms around it in education and commerce and communication, and the gospel goes out. And then there's another set of monks that go out and they form another monastery. And then people look at their lives and look at the way they're living, and things are going well until, of course, those monasteries get wealthy and powerful. And you know the routine. You're going to have renewal. You're going to have awfulness. You're going to get better. It's going to get worse. And we still have monasteries and monastic ideas even to today. So God is going to use these things, and these are the beginnings, and these are the seeds. So we will continue on looking at some of the ideas and some of the additional issues that are going to come across with this imperial church age, and some of the people in the key doctrinal development, the key teachers, and all. But again, the monastic movement is a reaction, which has a reaction, which is going to have a long-term influence on the way the church operates.